Welcome everyone to the second session of our lecture series, Historic House Museums Respond to Crisis. I am Sheridan Small, the Director of Education at Dumbarton House. Dumbarton House is a historic house museum located in Washington, D.C., and we're the headquarters of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America. We interpret life in the capital city in the early 1800s through the life of Joseph Nurse, the first Register of the Treasury, as well as the other individuals who lived and worked at Dumbarton House, both free and enslaved. This is the second lecture in a 6-part series funded by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I encourage you to sign up for all the other sessions if you have not done so already, as we will be exploring new topics and institutions each week as we learn how historic house museums have been responding in the past year or so to the urgent needs created by climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and social justice movements. Each session will be recorded and available on our YouTube page afterwards. But by being here this afternoon, you guys are all able to ask any questions you'd like. So please put those questions in the chat and we will have a Q&A at the end. Historic places are inherently resilient, and the work of preserving them is most effective when it is centered on our hopes for the future, rather than a static notion of the past. The interrelated challenges of a global pandemic and a national reckoning on race and equity have tested and proven these assertions at many types of historic places around the country. Our speaker today, Katherine Malone-France, Chief Preservation Officer at the National Trust, will explore how historic sites, legacy businesses, and preservation organizations have responded and evolved during this unprecedented period, and discuss how we carry forward lessons learned and new ideas to strengthen our cultural and economic infrastructure through historic preservation. Katherine Malone-France has served as the Chief Preservation Officer of the National Trust for Historic Preservation since 2019. In this capacity, she leads the organization's programmatic work in field services, government relations, state and local policy, research and development, trainings, grant making, and the stewardship and interpretation of the National Trust portfolio of 28 historic sites. Katherine is a graduate of Wofford College with a BA in history and has a master's in historic preservation from the College of Environment and Design at the University of Georgia. Throughout her almost 20 years in the for-profit and non-for-profit sectors of historic preservation, Katherine has made a concerted effort to work across the field, serving as the executive director of the Historic Hillsborough Commission in North Carolina, as the curator and deputy director at Decatur House, a National Trust historic site, and as the senior project manager at a highly respected preservation contracting firm in the Mid-Atlantic. From these experiences, Katherine brings the ability to understand preservation issues from a variety of perspectives and to move initiatives forward in ways that are both creative and strategic. During Katherine's time at the National Trust, she has led successful efforts to increase both the cultural and financial sustainability of National Trust historic sites across the country. This work has ranged from telling the full histories of these properties through creative and inclusive programming to implementing a new shared use operating model that combines commerce and interpretation to activate historic sites in new ways and attract broad audiences to them. Katherine's leadership has also resulted in a diverse range of collaborations with contemporary artists, creating new works inspired by National Trust historic sites and a revision of the National Trust collection management policy that has been hailed as a national model for its inclusion of historic structures and landscapes. Thank you for joining us, Katherine.
Thank you so much, Sheridan. So I'm delighted to be here, and thanks especially to you and to the National Society of Colonial Dames in America for this opportunity. I want to keep things fairly casual as we have this conversation. I do want to say that we're grateful for the opportunity to help fund this series, and I also want to note that one of our historic sites, the Hotel de Paris in Georgetown, Colorado, is owned and operated by the Colorado chapter of the National Society of Colonial Dames in America. It's run by a wonderful director named Kevin Kuharek, but we're so grateful for that partnership as well. Let me share my screen. All right. One second. Okay, there we go. Let's get started. I was particularly grateful when Sheridan and I started talking about this. She reached out first about historic sites, the National Trust historic sites, and in one particular one, she'd heard me talk about Cooper Malera, and wanted to know sort of how it was doing in the pandemic, and I'm going to talk about that. But I'm so grateful that Sheridan was really open to me speaking more broadly about a number of different historic places. And also about the broader work of the National Trust and so many of our partners around the country. And what I want to do today is just tell some stories of some places and what's been happening at those places over, say, the last 18 months, but in some ways much earlier than that. I'm sure that everybody on in this call, especially if you're affiliated with organizations that are operating historic places, that certainly work has not paused in the pandemic, but has continued in really important ways. And so I'll share some of those from our perspective. But we find ourselves facing these really intertwined, distinct but intertwined challenges: a pandemic, a long overdue reckoning on racial justice and equity, increasing political polarization, a changing climate, again, all of these challenges. And the way that we protect and interpret historic places, I think, really offers a hopeful way forward at this moment. As Sheridan said in her opening, to me, really, preservation is always hopeful work. Historic places, first of all, are inherently resilient. They're still here. And when we stop trying to freeze them artificially in time, I think they offer both a model and a physical place for our own continuing evolution. And they offer evidences of recovery and reconciliation in many ways. Historic places, again, and historic sites, I think in particular, have opened themselves up in new ways in the past 18 months. And they've really become places of respite, of inspiration, of truth-telling in ways that I think are so important. But more broadly, I think at a time when it is much needed, this work is demonstrating that historic preservation is a powerful tool for advancing justice and equity, because historic places tell us the truth about ourselves, and the ways we demonstrate our respect for each other's traditions and achievements is something we can do with historic preservation and through historic places. And then together, how do we carry those legacies forward? So I hope you'll see some of those themes as we talk today about historic sites and historic businesses and preservation organizations all across this country. So I am going to start with National Trust historic sites because that's what Sheridan asked me originally to talk about. And to talk particularly first, I'm going to talk about Cooper Malera Adobe in Monterey, California. So Monterey, as you may know, is actually as a city older than the United States. And it was a part of Mexico before it became a part of the United States in the 1850s. And it was, in fact, the capital of the sprawling Alta California province of Mexico. Cooper Malera itself, the property, began to be developed as the property we know today in the 1830s. It's right in the heart of today Monterey's National Historic Landmark commercial district. And it is a property with a rich history of both residential and commercial use. Back in 2016, this property had been managed for us for years by California State Parks, for decades, for California State Parks. But that agreement was ending and they needed to devote resources to properties they actually owned. And so we had the opportunity to really reconceive this site. And
Katherine,
we did so.
Sorry, not to interrupt you, but we can't see your slides in presentation mode. We just see the slide that has a list of sites. And
Oh
it
my
looks,
goodness. Okay, hold on.
it may have frozen.
Let me stop sharing. Thank you, Sheridan. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Let's get out of this. All right. Okay, let's try this again. Let's start with the share screen again. Okay, there we are. And now let's do this.
There we go. That looks like it's working.
Okay, let's go here. Here we are, back to Cooper Malera. Is that better?
Yes, thank you so much.
Great, thank you. No apologies. So Cooper Malera. So here it is, right in the heart of Monterey's commercial district. Had come back to us to come up with a new model for how to operate this property. And so what we came up with was this idea that we call shared use. And the idea that this property had always had multiple uses and that we could combine both museum spaces on the property with commercial partners that would reactivate buildings all over the property, that would earn revenue for the long-term preservation and operation of the property, and most importantly, engage the public in a range of new ways. So we reopened this property, and here you see it really activated. We reopened this property in September of 2019. As we did, we had the oldest residence on the property we maintained as a museum space, but our focus in the Cooper Adobe was how to break every single house museum rule we could think of. So you can sit on the furniture, you can carry your drinks around, you can play chess in the parlor, you can enjoy contemporary art mixed in with collections. It's just a place for the community, not just to come once, but to come again and again. You can walk in from the bakery with your coffee and walk around. And it's become this incredibly dynamic museum space, really appreciated by the community. And you know what? Nothing bad has happened. Nothing's been destroyed or taken or spilled on in a way that we can't fix. And again, it's really reconnected this museum space to its community. But that's not all of the property. We also brought in our commercial partners, our wonderful bakery, Alta Bakery, named, of course, for the province of Alta, California, as the capital of Monterey. This building on the property had actually been home to a bakery called the Pioneer Bakery at the beginning of the 20th century, and returned to that use as a bakery that you see here. One of the concepts of this shared use model is that all the entities on the property share the landscape, but also all the entities on the property share the stories through their operations. So Alta Bakery has done a number of things to do that. I'll highlight just one, which is the family's historic cattle brands, which are part of our collection. Today, they hang on the wall at Alta Bakery. And they're also dusted onto every loaf of bread. They're the latte art. There's an exhibit about them, but they go out into the world on lattes and bread and in chocolate in these really wonderful and creative ways. Again, absolutely no museum folks involved in developing that idea, all from our brilliant commercial partners. And then also the barns, which had long been vacant and closed to the public, reactivated as an event center. Again, a vibrant place for people to celebrate in all sorts of ways, but also a way to earn revenue for the historic site through our wonderful commercial partners. So we opened this whole thing in September of 2019. And of course, the pandemic came just as this whole place was getting its footing. I think most importantly in our response to the pandemic was first that we were able to keep the grounds and gardens open. We've never closed them throughout this period. In fact, we've activated them in new ways with yoga and with plant sales and with music and all sorts of community activities. Our businesses have also really fought to stay open, themselves running outdoor events and takeout and micro weddings and anything they could think of. And in fact, Alta Bakery has had its 3 best months in its 18-month history. It's had its 3 best months in the last month in terms of its receipts. And fortunately, we get a percentage of its gross sales. But I think really this property, and we hear this from the public all the time, has been a source of respite and of beauty and of inspiration, but also a source of hope. It's really been one of the only properties that stayed open in Monterey's downtown commercial district. And in a way, it has really become the very beating heart of downtown Monterey in a way that absolutely has met the vision that we've always had for this property. So moving on to another of our historic sites, very different from Cooper Malera, the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. The Farnsworth House is a modernist icon designed by Mies van der Rohe, and again, one of the most important modern residences in the country. One of the things that we've done during the pandemic, and I think historic sites across the country have done this, is really activated our landscapes in new ways. So lots of art taking place on the ground, special grounds passes for artists, plein air painters, photographers, and workshops for them as well. It's fortunate the Farnsworth House is glass, so you can see into it, but we've really recalibrated tours to include things like twilight picnics and moonlight tours that really center the house in this landscape and bring a new perspective to it. We've also added outdoor recreation like our canoe and kayak landing, all of which again have brought entirely new audiences, an entirely new way of looking at this property. But that entirely new way of looking at this property is also interpretive. And these plans were underway before the pandemic, but they have continued, pivoted in some ways to digital, but continued in really important ways because we are reframing the narrative at the Farnsworth House. Now, the Farnsworth House is most famous as a design by Mies van der Rohe. Architectural students and aficionados around the world, say the name the Farnsworth House in hushed and reverent tones, and yet very few of them know who the Farnsworth is. And the Farnsworth in the Farnsworth House is Edith Farnsworth. She is the incredible woman who commissioned the Farnsworth House, had the resources to commission the Farnsworth House from Mies van der Rohe. She was in the 1940s a board certified physician on the faculty of the University of Chicago. She's fluent in Italian, classically trained violinist, and again, with the resources to commission this house by Mies. In the historical narrative, including candidly our own at this site, she's long been dismissed as someone who sort of had a crush on Mies and someone who sued him because she thought he had too many cost overruns. But the story of Edith Farnsworth in this place is much deeper and more important and in some ways revolutionary than that. We're in the midst of what we call our campaign for Where Women Made History at the National Trust, which is an effort across this country to highlight and protect the places that tell women's stories and the places where those stories have often been obscured or overlooked, just like our own historic site here. So this has really been the year of Edith, despite the pandemic. We've refurnished the house entirely in the furniture that Edith Farnsworth had there, which is a great mix of modernist furniture, Americana, and Asian antiques. So it's been a total change for the Farnsworth House. And as I think many of the changes historic sites have seen during the pandemic, it's not a change that's going to stop. It's an ongoing reframing of this place to tell this important but heretofore overlooked story. And then I want to talk briefly about our historic sites, the last piece of this here on sites associated with enslavement, former sites of enslavement. Of the National Trust portfolio of 28 historic sites, 2/3 of those have histories associated with slavery. And here you see some of those varied sites pictured. And so again, we had begun well before the pandemic to focus on how to better interpret our historic sites associated with slavery, but not just interpret them, how to look really critically at their operations, the ways in which they generate revenue, and the ways in which they are governed. So a key element of this that was underway before the pandemic began, but took on even more importance, after the murder of George Floyd and others, and the ongoing, again, an overdue reckoning on racial justice and equity in this country. We have begun the planning for a symposium to look at this very question you see here. Can we do this? Can we ethically have celebratory events, not just weddings, but other kinds of events at places where human beings were held in bondage by other human beings? And so we held first this symposium on plantation weddings. And I want to give a tremendous amount of credit to Elon Cook-Lee, who's our Director of Interpretation and Education at our historic sites, who's leading this effort. She brought together a remarkable group of preservationists, people in the wedding industry, including the Knot Worldwide, social justice advocates and activists, descendant communities, academics, all for a 2-day symposium to have these very important conversations. And also, again, of course, our own historic sites of enslavement. What came out of that was this, really a holistic and a new and holistic approach to how we steward these sites. And by that, I mean, again, their interpretation, their operations, their governance. And you see the primary components of that here, both internally and externally. This is incredibly important work at the National Trust. In many ways, it is some of the most important work I think we are doing. And it is work that I don't believe ever stops. If we are going to own and steward these places, how do we do that in a way that is about truth and about equity? And I'll just note that while some of this is internal to us, we also really do look forward in many of the ways that you see on the right side of sharing this work externally as well. But really, I mean, this is the goal, to move from this very ethnocentric representation rooted candidly in white supremacy, to move from that to an equitable operation and interpretation and governance of these places. I would say candidly, our sites sit in this pink box, right? Still, in some ways, the stories of slavery held separate from the other stories, moving towards relative incorporation, and then ultimately this equitable incorporation. One of the key documents guiding this work is what you see here, this rubric of best practices for engaging with descendant communities at historic sites. This rubric was developed at Montpelier, the home of James Madison, Dolly Madison, and the more than 300 people they enslaved there. Today, it's a National Trust historic site, and it was the site back in 2018 of a National Summit on Teaching Slavery that was funded by our African-American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust. And this rubric of best practices in engaging with descendant communities was what came out of that. And again, it focuses not just on interpretation, but on shared authority and parity in governance and in operations as well. And so I do want to just highlight one major milestone that occurred recently, appropriately at Montpelier, where this rubric was created, making this rubric real, beginning the work of making this rubric real, particularly in governance. The board of directors of the Montpelier Foundation on June the 16th voted to change their bylaws to create structural parity with the Montpelier Descendants Committee, an organization of descendants, not just of people who were enslaved by the Madison family at Montpelier, but also in Orange County, Virginia. This was a tremendously important step forward. There's so much left to do, though, at Montpelier across our portfolio of historic sites. And I do believe this work is something that never stops. But I think incredibly important step in, again, how historic places and their preservation can advance justice and equity. So I want to switch gears a little bit, and again, grateful to Sheridan for the ability to do so, to talk a little bit now about our grant making at the National Trust, which is a tremendous part of our work, incredibly important. And during the pandemic, we were presented with a really unusual, not unusual, but a really exciting, I guess, sort of opportunity by a longtime partner, American Express, who came to us and said, would we be interested in a grant making program that focused on historic restaurants? Would we consider that part of our mission? And, my first response was, oh my goodness gracious, yes. I mean, historic restaurants are cultural treasures. They're community touchstones, and they're places of exchange and interpretation. I mean, they are historic sites in a way. They're places where culture is interpreted and shared in profound ways. And so we got this grant program going up and going really quickly to give away $1 million. It's been we opened nominations to the public, and it was one of our most popular nomination calls ever, with more than 3,600 nominations from across the country. Ultimately, a really talented team here and at American Express narrowed that down to 25 grantees, and they were all across the country, and just these incredible places that we were able to support with funds for the ongoing preservation of these buildings, but also their ongoing operations. The first grantees were announced on the Today Show, and the first two grantees, Daddy D's in Atlanta and the Four-Way Restaurant in Memphis. Again, these incredible stories of resilience, not just during the pandemic, but for decades, as these restaurants have been passed from generation to generation of families, from one owner to the next. They've served their communities in so many ways over the years, and then even despite the financial constraints of the pandemic, have been able to continue to support their communities. So again, an honor to be able to support them in their ongoing preservation. Just to pull out two examples of this, on the top, you see the Benneke Restaurant in Seattle, which is 117 years old today. And I'll just read you, as a way of telling their story, the first line of their application for this program, which was, Benneke will be 117 years old this year. We have survived the Spanish flu, World War I, World War II, and our return from the internment camps. It's an incredibly powerful story of resilience and of culture, as is El Cristo Restaurant in the heart of Little Havana, where they're going to be using their funds to upgrade their outdoor spaces, get new awnings, repair windows, and even add a mural painted by a Cuban artist that tells their story there, again, in the heart of Little Havana. And I want to talk last, and then we'll open this up for questions and discussion. I want to talk last about our advocacy work at the National Trust, which again touches on a variety of historic sites and historic places. The biggest advocacy campaign we run every year is our 11 Most Endangered Historic Places campaign. And this is a map of our 2021 list. This is a campaign we've run for more than 30 years, since the 1980s. In that time, we've listed more than 300 sites on the list, and less than 5% of those sites have been lost. We're looking through a public nomination process for sites that are nationally significant and tell the full true history of this country. We're looking for sites where there are there is a real threat, an urgent threat. We're looking for sites where there are people, preservationists and others already there at the local level fighting for these places that we can come in and support and amplify their work, and also places where there are preservation-based solutions. So it's an honor every year to select these places from the nominations we receive. In 2021, notably, every single place on the endangered list was associated with a community of color. And that was not the goal when we set out to make the 2021 list. Again, this is a very organic process that comes out of a public nomination process. But I think that makes it all the more important to recognize the truth of this list, which is that places that tell the full true history of our country and that are associated with the histories of communities of color are the most endangered historic places in this country. They are the most endangered historic places because they have been left out of the places that we designate, that we formally designate, that we elevate, and of the places, because of being left out of those designations, often they are not as well resourced. And so they are in danger from a number of threats. And what's lost if we lose places like this is the truth of who we are as a country and the powerful stories that these places tell. Now, 2021 was not the only time that this list has focused on places associated with communities of color. This is a much longer threat that exists and danger to these places. All but one site on the 2020 list was associated with communities of color, and over the last decade, more than half of all of the properties listed on the 11 most list have been associated with communities of color. This is an urgent threat to the full, true history of our country. So I want to just highlight a couple of these historic sites that are on the list. First, the farm camps that were the place that marchers who were marching from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights in 1964, the places where they camped, 1965, the places where they camped that spring. You know, perhaps the most well-known aspect of this story is what occurred on Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where protesters, including the late Congressman John Lewis, were beaten by Alabama state troopers and turned back. But ultimately, under a federal injunction, the march from Selma to Montgomery took place, except it's almost 50 miles from Selma to Montgomery, and so it couldn't be done in a day, and there was a need for places where the marchers could camp as they marched to Montgomery. And so 3 different families of African Americans who owned these farms, some of them who'd owned them since the early 20th century, volunteered at tremendous risk to their lives, to their properties, to their families, for these properties to be used as campsites for the marchers. At the David Hall home, the first night, Reverend Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King both camped there that first night. And it is just an incredible part of this story that is rooted in these places that are very much in need of preservation and support, because this part of the story cannot be lost. Of course, once the marchers get to Montgomery, Dr. King gives his "How long, not long" speech, which is incredibly important, and particularly in the context of our conversations today and the threats today to voting rights, these places take on an even greater meaning. So their preservation is incredibly important, as are the stories of these American heroes, the people who volunteered for their farms to be used as the campsites. And then I'll just touch on one more, the Summit Tunnel 6 and 7 and the Summit campsite in Truckee, California. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad to the history of the United States and its development. And the Summit Tunnels are how the Transcontinental Railroad passed through the Sierras. These tunnels were dug primarily by men who had immigrated from China. They were dug over a 2-year period, and they are extraordinary examples of the perseverance, the skill of the men who dug these tunnels through the Sierras. The longest of these tunnels is Tunnel 6. It is 1,600 feet long. In order to dig the tunnel, the men who dug it were lowered 120 feet below the surface of the ground. They worked by lantern light. They used hand tools, and when that wasn't moving fast enough, they used blasting powder. They chiseled not only 1,600 feet through solid granite, but doing so at a 30% grade, so chiseling up as well. When they came out of the tunnels, they camped in a makeshift campsite. And there they endured 2 of the worst winters on record in the Donner Pass. Again, these men who were primarily recent immigrants from China were paid less than their white counterparts. And today, the tunnels are largely unprotected, including not only their incredible architecture, but also the wealth of archaeological artifacts that are there, particularly associated with the campsites. This year's 11 Most had so many important themes: Black history and family stewardship, families that again have taken care of these places for generations, for decades, but they need support as they continue to preserve and carry forward these legacies. This is not just the stories of individual families, this is the stories of our country. This idea, again, of telling the full history, which is a key strategic priority of ours at the National Trust, represented on the list by, again, every single site, but I'll also note the Trujillo Adobe, 150-year-old Adobe in Riverside, California, and the Old Jato trading post, originally built 100 years ago as an Anglo trading post, but today owned and in the process of being revitalized by the Navajo Nation for their own economic development and community connection. And then incredibly topical issues, the Pine Grove School, Rosenwald School in Virginia, threatened by the construction of a giant landfill right across from it, a huge example of environmental racism and the environmental injustices that places like this have seen. The Boston Harbor Islands, where 12,000 years of human history exists, places that are still deeply sacred to Native Americans, are under threat every single day from a changing climate. The city of Boston has along with their partners, a new plan to address this, but the threat is very real, as it is to historic places across the country. And then the Order of Moses Cemetery in Virginia, threatened by, and not the first case of this, I'm sure, threatened by the expansion of our infrastructure that is coming, particularly in this case, in highway infrastructure. So here's the full list, which I guess you all saw for quite a while earlier when I was talking. But I would just urge you to take a look at this, check out savingplaces.org. And at each and every one of these places, you don't just learn about the stories, but we provide an advocacy action that you can take to be a part of how we save these places together and carry their legacies forward. I'll just note too that, just 2 weeks ago, we received this incredible news that the AfricanAmerican Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust had received a $20 million gift from Mackenzie Scott. And this was particularly a recognition of the vision and the dedication of Brent Leggs, who leads the AfricanAmerican Cultural Heritage Action Fund, but has also been doing this work particularly with African-American sites in the beginning of his career in the Northeast, but expanding all across the country. We created the African-American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, again, under Brent's leadership, right after the events of Charlottesville. And it is a key component of, again, our work to advance justice and equity through preservation. But certainly the Scott gift, I think, was an incredible validation, not just of that work, but of the idea that historic places and their preservation and activation are a powerful tool for advancing justice and equity. So just, to wrap up, I mean, to go back to what we talked about in the beginning, I do think preservation and the way we treat historic places can be incredibly hopeful work, and that it does speak to resilience and to recovery and to reframing our national narrative in ways that are truthful and that bring about real change. So again, it seems counterintuitive, I think, to some people, but it also seems incredibly appropriate that really preservation is about the future we're all building together. So thank you all. And with that, Sheridan, shall I just stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, if you want to, we can just have our faces on screen, and so we can answer everyone's questions. I see a few have come in the chat, and please keep putting them in. We do have some time to answer all your questions, so put any thoughts, comments, questions in there. And thank you so much, Katherine, for sharing the stories of all of those sites, those who are receiving the resources to continue into the future, those who are adapting due to all of the changes of not just the past year, but these kinds of changes are always happening to us, right? I think we kind of realized that with the pandemic because it was so major, but historic sites always have to adapt to the changing times, right? If they last 150 years, there's a lot of change through that time that they have to adapt to. And I think one thing the pandemic has taught us is that the public isn't too bothered by disruption. They're going to keep coming. They like seeing the changes. They like being part of those changes. So I hope everyone who's listening to this talk is inspired to try some new things at their sites and not be afraid of testing out some new things with the public and prototyping. So we have a couple questions here.
Great questions. And thank you. I see some folks I know too. Thank you, particularly Catherine Leonard and Chelsea Lundquist-Wentz for looking out for my slide presentation. I also want to say my colleague Chelsea Lundquist-Wentz, who's on this call, is really the PowerPoint mastermind behind my presentation. So she deserves credit for all those beautiful images.
Great to have her on. So these questions kind of span all the different topics that you were talking about. So we could start with, the last topic you were talking about, which is the 11 most endangered places list. Yes. So could you explain why the number 11?
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great question. It's one I get in the press a lot during the process. And the simple answer is, because it's not 10, because it stands out. There is actually, he is still working, just not at the National Trust. There's a guy named Ian Spatz who was, and I try to always give him credit for this. Ian Spatz was in marketing at the National Trust, and they were coming up with this idea of a list of 10 endangered places. And that just didn't quite have enough, oomph, right? It didn't really stand out. And so the story is that Ian just said, well, why not make it 11? And everybody around the table was like, oh my gosh, that's it. Okay. 11 it is. So more than 30 years later, thank you, Ian Spatz. Yeah, that's the simple answer. It's not 10.
It's simple but effective. It's fascinating.
Absolutely.
So speaking of endangered sites, you mentioned a few who are affected by climate injustice and climate change. But we have a question about whether there are perhaps other programs that the National Trust for Historic Preservation is doing to help sites prepare for these changes.
Well, thank you for this question. And I mean, again, this is a tremendous, threat facing historic places of all kinds all across this country and all around the world. You know, and I want to particularly highlight the work of Andrew Potts and the Climate Heritage Network, again, which is a global coalition of arts and culture organizations working to engage with this very issue. You know, and I highlighted the Boston Harbor Islands, where we're talking about, you know, threats from sea level rise, but you know, the threats of climate change take so many different forms: increasing storms, wildfires. I mean, they impact every kind of historic resource all around this country. And it is going to take, you know, everything we have to meet this challenge. And I feel like we are behind already. So there's an incredible sense, I think, of urgency to this work. I will note that this fall, November 2nd through the 5th, I believe, the National Trust Pass Forward Conference, one of our major themes will be climate change. Our overarching theme is Lead the Change, but one of the major program areas in the conference will be climate change. You know, and I think that's an opportunity to bring together so many different areas of great thinking about this, because again, I think it's an advocacy issue, but it is also an issue for individual historic sites and individual communities and individuals, just as they consider their place in the world all over this country. So looking forward to Pass Forward being able to bring a lot of that different work, you know, state historic preservation offices all across this country engaged in this, preservation organizations, not just at the national level, but the state and the local level, all working on this. And so bringing them together, I think, is going to be incredibly important. And again, the work, I think, of global efforts like the Climate Heritage Network is also incredibly important. Just one small historic sites-based aspect of this, we have just kicked off a program of climate action grants for our own historic sites. We just awarded, I think, 6 grants for prototype projects to demonstrate different approaches to climate change, sustainability, resiliency. They range from everything from at sites whose architecture had historic climate control, passive climate control features that, of course, as we went through that period where historic sites tried to, like, you know, sort of hermetically seal themselves for some kind of crazy collections reasons, you know, to restore, these were closed off, right? The use of cupolas and, again, more passive ways to pull hot air up and out. So several of our sites will be restoring those historic you know, climate control methodologies that I think is going to be really exciting. Again, you know, also looking at infrastructure, new wells on properties where there's a tremendous risk of fire. And then, you know, last of all, looking at biodiversity at our historic sites and how we can support a more biodiverse world. You know, there's always something to learn. We have owned these places for 70 years, and there's always something new to learn about them. And as a part of this grant program, we learned that one of our sites, Chesterwood, which is in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, the home of Daniel Chester French, sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial, we learned in an area that we were looking at for potential solar field, we learned was actually a protected wetlands as a vernal pond. And not only a vernal pond, but a vernal pond that's incredibly important to the mating of the spotted salamander. And so actually one of the climate action grants is planning to better protect that wetland, better steward it, and better share the story of that cute little spotted salamander and the biodiversity with the public who visits Chesterwood. So we'll be sharing these climate action grant stories. We just made the awards, so we'll be sharing them further. And actually Sarah Sutton, who I think has already presented. Yes.
Mhm.
So Sarah is one of the advisors on our climate action grant. So grateful to that. But there's a lot to be done on this without question. And it is going to take every single aspect of the preservation world to address the impacts of climate change on our historic resources.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very promising to hear about all the things that are in the works, and I look forward to hearing more about those projects. Sarah presented 2 weeks ago, and she gave a lot of examples of some of those passive forms of climate control at historic house museums. So if anyone missed that talk, it's recorded and it's on our YouTube page. So definitely check that out. So we also actually have Vizcaya Museum and Gardens presenting later on, and they were one of the 11 endangered sites in 2008, and they'll be talking about their responses to climate change. So definitely tune back in if you're interested in this topic.
Well, and our Pass Forward conference will be online this year, but next year we're going to be in Miami in 2022. So again, I feel like that's a great place for us to, again, see work that's happening in places like sites like Vizcaya, as they are really, on the leading edge of dealing with very, very critical questions of how they respond, not in 5 or 10 years, but right this minute. I'd also draw folks' attention to the City of Boston's climate plan, which was just released around climate action plan, which was just released around the time of the 11 most, and particularly focused on the Boston Harbor Islands.
Thank you. So I want to pivot to changes like in interpretation, but really this question applies to changes in general. You spoke about how at the Cooper Malera, people are allowed to walk around with food, they're allowed to sit on the furniture. How do you help the stewards of these sites, whether they're staff or the board, from help them move away from a model where we feel like we have to keep a historic site frozen in time, and help them be more comfortable with allowing change, whether it's an interpretive change, a business model change, or something else? Have you found that there is resistance to change, or what are some methods that you see are working?
Certainly there is resistance to change. Anytime change is present, there is resistance to it. Right? It is a given. But Sheridan, in some ways, you said it earlier, I think. I mean, it's this idea, though, that historic places are going to continue to change. They have changed for all of their existences. Places evolve. My background is in cultural landscapes, and so I think often that's the sort of analogy I go to, which is that maybe we can imagine that we could freeze a building in time, but you can't possibly imagine that you could freeze a landscape in time, right? Landscapes are too dynamic and too active. And the truth is, and again, I say this as a cultural landscape person, your buildings are part of cultural landscapes. they don't exist on their own. So I do think, that in the places like Cooper Malera, where we've brought about significant change in operating model, or places like the Farnsworth House, where it's been the change in the story, or places like Montpelier, where it's really a change in governance. I think in all of those, the acknowledgement that this is going to be difficult, and this is going to require everyone to step outside of themselves in some ways, and ultimately, in all of those very good examples, and I think in so many other ones that I can think of, what ultimately brings people together to move forward, in my experience at historic sites, is the place itself and the power of that place. And I think that is always a commonality, even when people have very different views about how to interpret or govern or use a historic place. The power of the place itself is, I think, often a unifying force. And I think in all of those cases, ultimately, it was about saying, we may not agree on everything, but we agree on the power of this place. And how do we then build from that agreement make sure this place is protected and preserved and sustained in ways that can carry its legacies forward.
Start from a place of common agreement. That's
yeah,
great.
And of a love of the place
Mm-hmm.
and an appreciation of the place, I think.
Absolutely. So our last question is
Sure.
more about the economic revitalization you're speaking about
Sure.
at the beginning. So you just said, buildings are part of historic landscapes. They don't exist on their own. Well, they're also part of the communities, right? They don't exist in a bubble. So it was really interesting to hear about Cooper Malera partnering with businesses and to see how, with the restaurant, saving small restaurants, how historic preservation is part of preserving a community economically as well as culturally, which I think a lot of people don't think about when they think of historic preservation. They think of a museum, but not necessarily a whole neighborhood. So I was wondering if you could provide any advice for historic sites looking to maybe form partnerships with local businesses or otherwise kind of branch out in a more sustainable way to sustain their finances?
Sure. Well, you've hit, Sheridan, on the key word, which is partnerships, right? And unexpected partnerships, looking outside of the usual suspects with whom you partner, I think is a key first step. In terms of resources, again, we've certainly provided lots about the agreements and other things, that the structures that undergird Cooper Malera. I'd also refer you to one of our subsidiaries, Main Street America, which is very focused on the preservation of historic commercial districts. And again, often that connection between other community institutions and those commercial districts. But I think, it's also about, and I think you said this earlier too, Sheridan, I think it's also about just acknowledging that historic places are places where we can try things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, but we're not going to break these places. They're stronger than that. They're more powerful than that. They've been holding these stories for longer than we've been telling all these stories. And so trusting, I think, in the power of these places to be places where we can experiment and we can try new things with new partners. That's, I think, to me, that's the essence of preservation. And it's also, again, why historic places are so powerful, not because they're frozen in time, but because they give us places to evolve and change.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great note to end on, because that's what I'm hoping these sessions teach people, whether they are museum professionals, whether they're in the historic preservation field, or whether they just like going to museums. I want people to see that these places that preserve history are also dynamic places that change and adapt. And we can learn so much about how we're going to enter the future as well as how we survive the past. So thank you so much, Katherine. This has been wonderful. I put a link to a survey in the chat. So if you're still on, thank you for staying with us. And if you could just click that link and share your thoughts about the program. We are gathering thoughts on every session. So if you filled it out last time, please just fill it out again. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks for our next presentation. Thank you again, Katherine.
Thanks, Sheridan. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.